We need delivered from our prisons, don't we? The thing with our lives, it seems, is as if we've gotten good. We've become really good at carrying our prisons with us. I love what the old rabbi said in response to the Israelite wandering in the desert for 40 years. You've probably heard me say this. I wish I had thought of this, but it came from the rabbi who said, when God brought them out of Egypt and into the wilderness, it only took him one night to get him out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of them. Deliver us from our prisons. And in this sense, this is really the warp and woof of what I want to look at when we start talking about sacrifice today. Ordinary sacrifice. Those things in our life that we carry with us. I don't know about you, but I've got things that I carry with me, stuff. And it seems like the older I get, the longer that list becomes. I'm becoming more irritable. I'm becoming less patient, it seems, not more patient. And this frustrates me. Our lives are a kind of sacrifice that really are the measure that show what we love and where our hope lies. That's what we're going to be talking about today. But I want to begin with the story, David's story in 2 Samuel chapter 24. Now, David has high moments and low moments. This is the story of David. And if you know the story of David, we've been reading 1 and 2 Samuel these last couple of months. Hopefully you've read through certainly more than we can cover on a Sunday morning. But David has really great moments and then really bad moments. As high as David gets in his good moments is as low as he stoops in his bad moments. And it's interesting that 2 Samuel would conclude its telling of the story with this story. There's actually more to the story of David than we see in 1 and 2 Samuel. You have to go to 1 and 2 Chronicles to get kind of the rest of that. And in fact, the story that we're going to look at today in 2 Samuel is also mirrored in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. A couple of the names are a little bit different pronunciations more than anything else, and a couple of details, I think one of which is important, but you do get the rest of David's story. This is where we're going to leave David's story, though, as we prepare for the book of Ephesians next month. But it's an interesting story. It starts off with the passage saying that God was once again angry with Israel. We aren't told why. We don't know what has transpired. And then it says something interesting. It says that in a sense, God incited David to take a census of this nation. New king. And it says that God incited David to take a census. Now what's interesting is this very census that he would take would become a sin for him. Not that censuses are, is that plural? What's the plural for census? I don't even know. Not that censuses are sinful, but there was something in David that needed dealt with. Now, if you read this story in 1 Chronicles 21, it actually says that the Satan incited David to take the census. And while we're familiar with differences in story, like in our Gospels, where the details are a little different, but they don't matter, like theologically, this seems like an important point, doesn't it? Was it God or was it Satan? Because we don't want to get that mixed up. This is a big deal. Here's what you need to know about this as you're reading through. The Jewish mind did not have a concept of secondary causes. Here's what I mean by this. For instance, we might say, if something horrible happens in our life, we might say something like, well, God allowed that to happen. the Jew would have no concept of that, no appreciation of that. If God has power to do or not, or prevent something and doesn't, then for their mind, God is the author of it all. And we see this in the discrepancy between the texts. We see it in the story of Exodus. Remember God hardening Pharaoh's heart? The thing we miss, we argue about this a lot, but the thing we miss is that for 5 plagues, plague 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it says, and Pharaoh hardened his heart, and Pharaoh hardened his heart, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. And about halfway through, something shifts. And it's almost like God comes at these moments in our life and partners with our obedience or disobedience. Look at the book of Romans, chapter 1. God gave them over to their depravities. And I think here's what's going on with David. And the Jew didn't make that fine nuance, but David begins a census. His advisors even tell him, don't do it. One of his top advisors said, don't do it. And David does it. And the advisor did David's bidding. And we find out in there what really was going on. David was beating his chest with a kind of arrogance and pride. He was counting, in particular, he was counting his fighting men. My army's bigger than your army. My nation has more people than your nation. It was about showing that he's a great king. We see this with every presidency. Isn't it amazing? Every president thinks that they are the most revolutionary president than any other president ever. This presidency has accomplished more in 4 years than the previous. However, every president has said that, except Jimmy Carter. But he was a very humble man, so still is. But in that, there's an arrogance here. And it was about David's fighting men. In fact, when you go down, you actually get those numbers. Here they are. And David realizes along the way, I blew it. I sinned. Here's the thing about sin. A lot of times we think sin is just between me and God. Or it only affects me. Or just those with whom I was involved. But what we forget is sin affects everything around us. And so when David started numbering his fighting men and taking the census and figuring out taxes and whatever else was going to come out of this, God said, in a sense, you're so proud of your numbers, let's get rid of some of the numbers. Oh, punishment was coming. God was like a parent. He gave David a choice. Have you ever given your kids choices on their punishment? Like, I'm going to spank you now, or you've got to do 100 push-ups. My parents always made us do push-ups and sit-ups and different things like that. And you think 100's a lot. That was a warm-up. Like, I did a lot of push-ups. I also got a lot of spankings. Somehow, I ended up with kids that are much better than I ever was. I honestly can't remember the last time I spanked one of my children. We just haven't ever had to do that. So it must have all been poured out on me. I was like the sacrificial offering. But I remember getting those choices. Well, what do you want? What do you want? And if I didn't have an answer for the punishment, the options they gave me, the Choose Your Own Adventure Punishment Edition, if I didn't have an answer for that, my mom would look me in the eye, her one blind eye, blood pressure raised, that blind eye would always go sideways. It was so scary. And she would spit when she talks, and she'd pin me against the wall. And she says, tonight, buddy, if you wonder what I'm thinking as I lie awake in bed, it's going to be planning ways to make your life miserable. So, there it is. And I believed her. She was creative. But God gives, like a parent, God gives David choice of punishments. Here are the choices. 3 years of famine, 3 months of being routed or pursued by enemy nations, like being in a losing battle or a losing war, or 3 days of pestilence, think pandemic. 3 years of famine, 3 months of defeat by enemies, or 3 days of pestilence. David, I think, did a wise thing. He says, I can't choose this. And he fell upon the mercy of God. I think probably hoping that God would be merciful as God was, as God is. What ended up happening was a pestilence. Doesn't tell us what. Doesn't tell us if it was sores. Doesn't tell us if it was West Nile virus. It just doesn't tell us what it is. What we know is tens of thousands were dying. And an angel. 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles differ a little bit in these details. But this angel appeared standing over top of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is about to fall with this, whatever it was. Think angel of death almost, like you get in Exodus chapters, 12 and 13, right in there. And whether David, Chronicles seems to suggest that David saw this angel, but whatever it is, David knows that where this angel is standing is kind of ground zero for what is about to happen in Jerusalem. So he's going to go. Gad, one of his advisors, suggests this. He's going to go and he's going to offer a sacrifice to God. So he goes to this place. It's a farm, some kind of grain. And the owner of the farm is a man by the name of Aranah, or if you go to 1 Chronicles, Arnon. Dialects are a little bit different. And David approaches. Now let me tell you about this place where he approaches. It says it was a threshing floor, and I'm going to read some of this in a moment. A threshing floor. That place where the harvested grain would come in. It was usually on a rock surface, and they would bring in the sheaves. They would bring in the sheaves. See, I do know old songs. They would bring in the sheaves, and they would beat them against the rock, get that grain off, and then they would have these threshing sledges. I saw one on a movie I was watching the other night for the first time. I was like, I finally have a visual of this. And they would beat that grain until the grain fell, and then, you know how this works, then the chaff, the stalk would be removed. The grain would remain, and then they'd still need to clean it out, so they'd use a pitchfork or a shovel. They'd throw it up in the air. The wind would blow away what remains, and all you have left is the fruit. There's something about this threshing floor, I think, that speaks to our life. Because when we start talking about sacrifice, it's a kind of threshing that occurs in our life. So often we think that the threshing process, or even us preachers, I've done this, we've made the mistake of saying that the whole thing with wheat and chaff, the threshing thing is about us and them. We're the grain, they're the chaff. No, it all grows together. It's about what God is doing in our life, not about how God is sending the world to hell. All right? What is going into the fire is the chaff of our life. It disappears. Isn't that good news? There is something in this story for us. And so we come to this, but here's what's interesting. Outside of Scripture, history gives us a tradition of this place. Here's what history says. That Aranah or Ornan, whichever book you're reading, whenever he got this land, purchased this land, we don't know how he came in possession of it, but that place, that threshing floor, wasn't just any rock. It was kind of the rock. Not Dwayne Johnson, but in Genesis 22, we hear a story of Abraham needing to offer a sacrifice. Do you remember this story? Take your son, your only son, Isaac. Remember this one? Take him up, and there was an altar made, and Abraham's hand was in motion, and then God stayed his hand, the angel of the Lord stayed his hand, then there was a ram in the thicket, and Isaac's place was taken by the lamb, and Abraham named the place Jireh. God provides, because he provided. Remember that story? Tradition says that where Ernah's threshing floor was that same rock. You know what else is important about this? If you go to Israel today, you can see that rock. Now, that may be a little harder for some of us, because you see, tradition has, when David purchased that land, he built a temple there. Well, he wanted to. It actually ended up being Solomon. Solomon built a temple on that rock, as the story goes. And then later it fell during the Babylonian captivity and the Assyrian exile and all of that, and they came back and they rebuilt it. And then later King Herod in Jesus' day did this monster project, and it was in its heyday, the temple. It was on that spot. We know in 70 AD that temple was destroyed. And in its place was put a Muslim mosque. We call it the Dome of the Rock. Google images. Because if you go inside, again, it may be a little more difficult for you and me, but if you go inside, there is a gantry all the way around this exposed top of a mountain. It's that rock. Isn't that cool? By tradition, Abraham and Isaac. By tradition, this story that we're reading. By tradition, the temple. It's like ground zero for our life. It's ground zero for sacrifice. And that's what we need today. So we come to this idea of sacrifice with these words. Let me read the end of this story. 2 Samuel. I want to begin with verse 17. It's kind of a kicker. It gets us into it. And it's simply this. It begins with David saying, acknowledging, behold, I have sinned and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, he's speaking of his people, what have they done? Please, O God, let your hand be against me and my father's house. And Gad came that day to David and said to him, go up, raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went up at Gad's word as the Lord commanded. Notice this in verse 20, a small detail. And when Araunah looked down, it was up on a mountain. Here comes David on the path. When Araunah looked down, he saw the king and his servants coming on toward him. And Araunah went out and paid homage to the king with his face to the ground. And Araunah said, why has my lord the king come to his servant? David said, to buy the threshing floor from you, in order to build an altar to the Lord. Then Araunah said to David, let me back up. In order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be averted from my people. Then Araunah said to David, let my lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. All of this, O king, Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God accept you. But the king said to Araunah, no, but I will buy it from you for a price. And here is one of David's highest moments, I think. And may we hear these words. He says, for I will not offer burnt offerings. I will not offer a sacrifice to the Lord my God, that which costs me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord responded to the plea of the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. I will not offer a sacrifice to the Lord my God, that which costs me nothing. Shall we talk about sacrifice? It's not a fun word, is it? We would like to get without having to give. We would like to receive without needing to sacrifice. Yeah. We would like to have relationships where we get what we need out of the other people without having to deal with all of those pesky emotions in them. Or the time that maintaining a relationship takes. We would like that. We would like to be able to create batteries for our cell phones without stripping lithium out of the ground, or put gas in our car without having to pump petrol, where am I, in Europe? Without having to pump petroleum. We would like these things. We would like to be able to grow a garden without having to pull weeds. We would like to be able to raise children without having to administer discipline. Right? We would like things that come to us without sacrifice. We'd like to receive a check from work without actually having to go to work. Right? We would like these things, but life is really a series of sacrifices. Even the smallest thing, the most ordinary thing. If I buy a Red Bull from Quick Trip at $2.99 a can, I am sacrificing 2 hamburgers from McDonald's. I am sacrificing probably good health and good judgment. Right? Everything we do is a sacrifice, one thing for another. There's nothing in our life that does not have some measure of sacrifice. So as we come to this idea of sacrifice, we've got to understand what sacrifice does. It demonstrates for us what we love. Because whatever we love the most is that thing that we will sacrifice the most for. Wouldn't that be an interesting study in your own home? What do I sacrifice the most amount of time to? Is it sleepless anxiety? Is it wringing your hands? What is it? Is it frustration? What do you sacrifice the most time to? What do you sacrifice the most financial resources to? You know? You can have financial resources or you can have kids. It's like the choice, right? It's all of those things. Do you like a savings account? Well, don't have children. So everything is a sacrifice, but it's a measure of what we really love. Even those things in our life that we don't love, we do in a twisted way because we keep giving our best to those things. So this is really what it's about. Sacrifice is a tool that we are given that causes us to measure those things that we truly love in our life. You sacrifice for that which you love, and you love that for which you sacrifice. Everything. This is ordinary. This is a part of every moment of our life. We are making this decision. And in fact, I dare say it seems to me that every decision is a kind of sacrifice. One thing over another. We are demonstrating with every action what we love by what we sacrifice. What you love the most is seen in what you sacrifice the most for. And so here we have David saying this line, I will not offer a sacrifice to the Lord my God, that which costs me nothing. But the Old Testament doesn't always give us a consistent message on sacrificing, does it? We have the Levitical law. If you haven't read Leviticus recently, don't. No, I'm kidding. It's in the Bible. You should totally read it. But it's tedious. And you'll read it, and you'll go outside, and you'll drop your pen on the ground, and you'll think you'll need to kill your dog for a burnt offering. It plays with your head, the Levitical code. And it's a sacrifice for everything. And do it this way, and don't do it that way, and don't forget this little detail. And oftentimes we get bound up in those rituals until we come to verses like what I read earlier out of Hosea 6, accidentally, or Micah 6, on purpose. And it seems like God doesn't know. Does he want sacrifice or doesn't he want sacrifice? Let me read it again from Micah 6, because this is going to shape how we tell the story, the rest of this story today. Micah 6, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? Ooh, was that prefiguring Christ? Or shall I give the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, or mercy. King James NIV say mercy. ESV, NRSV, NASB, almost all the others say kindness. And I'm going to talk about that. I think I like it. I'm not sure yet, though. To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before the Lord. Here's, church, what I am maintaining is our costly and ordinary sacrifice. I will not offer a sacrifice to the Lord my God, that which costs me nothing. Can I tell you, justice costs something. Kindness costs something. I don't like that. Humility costs a lot. And in fact, I think that's what all of this is about. What was David's sin? It was pride. Do you know what is at the root of every sin? Do you know what your sin actually is? It's pride. From Willy Wonka, I want it and I want it now. That's sin. It's pride. The root of every sin, let me say it this way. Every sin is pride. It's just what you do is the symptom of that sin. The sin is not the thing itself. That's the symptom of the sin. The sin is pride. My way, not God's way. So, we begin with this question, what needs sacrificed in your life? What needs sacrificed in my life? You see, sacrifice is what we need, not what God needs. I don't desire 1,000 rams and 1,000 rivers of oil. I desire justice. I desire mercy. I desire humility. So here it is, our ordinary sacrifice. Let's look at it first with ordinary justice. Ordinary justice. To act justly. That's what this passage says. You see, ordinary justice is more than just be like something or a kind of moral ethic. We do that good in the church. We are righteous. Justice and righteousness in the biblical languages are near synonyms. And we like being righteous because we have our moral ethics. The problem is so often we have our moral ideas of what is right and what is wrong, and we miss the fact that the Bible doesn't talk about morality or justice as an ethic. It talks about it as an action. You can say stuff all day long about what you believe and what is right and what is wrong, but if justice is not enacted, it is not just. Ordinary justice is not about figuring it out correctly. That's important. But it's about doing the right thing. Even our national pledge insists upon this when it says that the goal of our own national fervor is toward the end of liberty and justice. I think we've forgotten this part, for all. Man, that should have been in the Bible. It totally was. You see, there is a reason why this is the last line of our pledge. It is to remind us that the goal of our elections is not just for how the nation in which we participate can serve me, can lower my taxes, or can ensure a job for me. The goal of this nation is liberty and justice for all. That requires sacrifice, doesn't it? Have we forgotten this? All of this other stuff is okay, but our own pledge reminds us that the thing that we are to aim toward is freedom and justice for everyone. You see, it's about enacting the words of promise that we have inherited. I simply do not have the luxury as an American, or more importantly, as a follower of Christ, to demand justice if I will not be just. This is a sacrifice. Because when we see where justice is not happening, there are times that we are called to sacrifice our liberties for the sake of another. That's biblical. That's biblical. Sometimes we must question our liberties against the cost of that liberty. If my freedoms come at the expense of another's bondage, then love demands that I sacrifice my freedoms so that another may not be oppressed. This is hard. This is what justice is. Even in terms of our national identity, I think it's a sentiment that is best exemplified in the great poem that decorates the statue in New York Harbor. We know part of that poem. Have you heard the whole poem? It's breathtaking. Ella Lazarus wrote it. It's breathtaking. And she compares that colossus, that massive statue in the New York Harbor, to that ancient lost wonder of the world, the Colossus of Rhodes. Remember hearing about that. That statue that is now lost, but was said to speak of conquest and conquering and the Greek culture. And we want the best. We have the best armies. We have the best culture. We have the best thinkers. And here's this colossus of a statue saying, if you are less than the best, get out of here. Here's what Ella Lazarus's poem actually says, a portion of which you know. But that portion will mean nothing to you if you don't know the rest of it. We should memorize this. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she. Your huddled mass, cries she with silent lips. Give me, you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Isn't that beautiful? Justice demands that even in our pursuits of liberty, sometimes we give up our rights for the sake of another. It's a sacrifice. Can I tell you, as a church, I think we got it going on. I do. Crossing guards twice a day. Every day school is open. Whether the rain or whatever the weather, you're out there. Lord's Diner, Marilyn and Dave are celebrating her mother's birthday today, so they're not here. But Marilyn has this problem with the Lord's Diner. We have too many volunteers. And everyone's like, I want to volunteer more. And she's like, I don't have any more spaces to allow everyone to volunteer. This is our problem. I love this problem. It's the countless acts of service done anonymously and quietly in the church. Our children's workers downstairs even now who we never see. But be careful. Just because we celebrate these places where we have done well, do not become complacent in your sacrifice of love and the justice it demands. Ordinary justice. Here's the second thing. Ordinary mercy or kindness. Mercy is a tricky word, isn't it? Mercy. We think mercy is what we don't get when we deserve something bad. And that's true. We always compare mercy to grace. Grace is the good thing we get when we don't deserve it, and mercy is the bad thing we don't get when we deserve it. Mercy, we cry. Right? And that's a good enough definition. But sometimes that becomes used so much that it means almost nothing. But kindness? Kindness is a sacrifice. Can I tell you, kindness is not my native language. I struggle. Having just spent part of the week at district assembly with all of the insiders with comb-overs and pants pulled up above their belly buttons and ties tied too wide and all of that stuff. This family that we call Nazarenes, I love Nazarenes, but we have a look. And there they were, Dumbledore walking around. No, I'm kidding. You see, kindness is not my native language. And when I get in these rooms, oh, it's hard. It's hard. And I only stood. I prayed I was going to behave, and I only stood and addressed the assembly once. And it was not rude, right? I was under control. My wife slunk down in the chair the whole time. This is where I struggle. I don't struggle with kindness to the people in the world because I know what they look like. They look like the world. I struggle with kindness with people in the church. That's my struggle. Where's yours? Kindness. Can I tell you, right now our culture and our context is devoid of kindness. I'm not talking about our church. We are a kind, loving church, and I see you interacting with people, and I see it, and we've got, again, I think we've got something going on, but we live in a world that's not kind. We're so divided. We're so angry. We're so easily offended. I mean, I watch the news to listen for things to give me a reason to throw things at my TV. And we walk around waiting to be offended. We really do. This is not for the world. This is for the Christians. Kindness is a sacrifice. Because the hardest people to be kind to are the ones who seem to deserve the retribution you want to bring. Here's why kindness is such a sacrifice. Because it means loving your enemies. That's what it means. Kindness. What would happen if Christians became kind? I'm not worried about the rest of the world. What if we became kind? What if we listened even though we disagree? What if we loved even though we really don't want to? It's a sacrifice. It's going to require something from you. And I think what it requires from you is actually found in this last point, walking humbly before the Lord. The biggest sacrifice is going to be you. That living sacrifice. It's going to be you. Pride, arrogance, whatever it is. But notice, walking humbly with the Lord. It's not just go home and become humble. Like, I'm not going to go home and sit in my chair and think, okay, I've got to become humble now. And I don't think there is any such thing as a humble person. I think there are only people becoming humble. We're all in the process of becoming humble. But it comes down to this: walk humbly before the Lord. Our humility is not based in some kind of pious action. Our humility is based in knowing that we're not God. And the only way we're going to know we're not God is if we encounter God. This is what it boils down to. If you want to work on humility, work on knowing God. Here's what happened in David's life, and it's such humility. If you encounter the divine, here's what you'll find. Whether you like it or not, you're going to start confessing and repenting things in your life. Every knee will bow, every tongue confess, in heaven and on earth and under the earth. Right? This is what's going to happen. And with David, he says it right there in verse 17. He says, I have sinned greatly against God. And he did it again. You remember the whole Bathsheba story, that twisted little detail, killing the husband of Bathsheba because he got her pregnant. And then he was confronted. It's the first time the phrase, you to man, happens in history, because Nathan comes and he tells the story, and David's like, who is this guy? I'm going to get him. And Nathan is like, you're the man, you to man, you to man. And David repents, because when you encounter God, this is what happens. Psalm 51. Psalm 51, have mercy. These are David's words. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from sin. Against you and you only have I sinned. Well, that may have been a bit of an overstatement on his part, but he was writing poetry. So this is what it means. What is humility? It's got to come with confession and repentance. We're not God. And if nothing else, if you've got nothing else to confess the fact that you're not God. You know, sometimes we sanctified folks, we folks inside the holiness tradition who talk about the cleansing of that sinful nature, we sometimes make it sound like we've got nothing to confess. Well, I don't have to sin. No, you don't. And I'm not saying you did. But can we confess the fact that God is God and we're not? Right? Humility. There's humility. There's humbleness there. We get so caught up in thinking we can strong-arm our way through whatever it is that we miss the fact that God is the only way we'll get through it. The things that we're addicted to, we need humbled from. The addiction to social media and to affirmations and public applause, the addiction to gossip that paints you in a picture where you're better than someone else, the addiction to comparison that makes you either feel superior to someone else or more inevitably makes you feel inferior to others, the addiction of needing more at the cost of the constant panic and insights, never having enough, having anxiety that is induced by needing to protect what we've got at all costs. It's the addiction to knowledge without action. It's the addiction of religion without faith. It's the addiction of love without sacrifice, and this is what it all boils down to. So, what do you need to sacrifice? I will not offer a sacrifice to the Lord my God, that which costs me nothing. This is going to cost something. But the promise of God is that where our lives are sacrificed to God's own extraordinary love, our very ordinary existence is given a new life. Did you know that the sacrifice of your life does not kill Jesus on the cross over and over again? It already happened once for all. That sacrifice was made. It's already been done. The sacrifice that really changes things is not us waiting for Jesus. It's Jesus waiting for us. This is what really changes things. This is what promises to make us new. God, get this, has already forgiven you. God has already made your new life available. The question is will you sacrifice the old life? That's really what it boils down to. And it's going to cost something. But in the end, what you find is what it costs you is so much less than what you are given. So here's the question. Will you give it up? What is it? Whatever it is, will you give it up? Will you give it over? Even though it costs you something? No, and not just something. Get this, it's going to cost everything. It's going to cost everything, your whole life. But in the end, the only thing you are really giving up are those things that are threatening even now to destroy you. Those things that will ultimately lead to death. Yet, in the sacrifices we offer, we finally find that the ordinary, the extraordinary grace of God promises that where sacrifice is made, life is birthed. So, this is the question today, isn't it? I know. I've got things to sacrifice. My little 2-day foray to district assembly reminds me just how native for me the language of condescension and mockery is. I got to get rid of that. It means I'm going to have to bite my tongue at times. It means I'm going to have to change my habits. It means I'm going to have to humble myself before God so that, as it says in Philippians, I have the very mind of Christ in me. How about you? What is it? We're going to sing a song. It's such a good song. You can stand, you can sing, you can kneel and pray, you can come and pray here. But as we sing, ask God, what is it? What is it? Guess what? He'll tell you, because on the other side of sacrifice is resurrection, and that's what he wants for you today. So stand with me and sing.
Well, everyone needs compassion.